Uh, Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Ahmed, and the Affinity team for allowing me to speak, ladies and gentlemen. Um, as Noah has established, Yemen has almost always been a nation in conflict, either through internal strife or by proxy, through more other powerful actors who had sought to settle differences or exert influence. I'd like to point out some key facts here, if I may. I think they might help set the scene for the current conflict. Yemen is a failed state. It ranks as the fourth top failed state out of 178 countries, according to the Fund for Peace, which issues annual rankings based on security, stability, and foreign influence, among other factors. It is, as Noah mentioned, one of the poorest countries in the world, ranked 168 out of 188 countries on the United Nations Human Development Index. We also need to remember that Yemen is the ancestral home of Osama bin Laden, and until a few years ago was a major stronghold for Al-Qaeda. The country is deeply tribal, and traditions and customs overrule or dictate the constitution at almost every level. Yemen has a population of 27 million people, and the country has the second largest ownership of guns, behind only the United States. There are 54 guns for every 100 Yemenis. On my first visit to Yemen, my photographer and I walked through the streets of Sana'a, the capital. The photographer, a 30-something intelligent man, stopped in the middle of the street. He was on his first assignment in the Middle East, and he started shooting. He was shooting at almost nothing and everything. When I asked him what was wrong, he said, "Look at all those men with AK-47s. I looked at him and I said, "Save your film. This is like you carrying an umbrella on a rainy day." I guess being a Lebanese has its perks. Over the past 3 decades, the country has endured 9 wars, 2 insurgencies, and a revolution. If I was to sum up the nature of any Yemeni conflict in one sentence, it would be this: an unpredictable shifting of alliances across the board. This presentation will clearly demonstrate that. This latest conflict began in March 2015 when the Houthis, a Shia group backed by Iran, overran the capital Sana'a. The Houthis had for a decade tried unsuccessfully to wrestle more political power and influence from the central government. And for a decade, the central government, led by former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, waged a relentless war against them, backed by Saudi funds and US arms. In 2000, during one of my assignments to Yemen, I asked a senior military official how much of a threat the Houthis were. His response astonished me then, as it does now. He said the group was nothing more than a nuisance. I remember it clearly because all the research and analysis I had done told me they were a force to be reckoned with. They were organized, they were systematic in their approach, and they were resilient. 18 years later, they're virtually running the show. In 2016, the Houthis formed an alliance with former President Saleh, the man who just 12 years ago prior had sent troops that killed their then leader, Hussein al-Houthi. From sworn enemy to brother in arms. My enemy's enemy is my friend. Shifting alliances. A year later, Saleh was killed by his foes, turned allies, turned foes again. The Houthis were dismayed after Saleh, in early December 2017, publicly announced his openness to talks with the Saudi-led coalition. Considered a traitor, he was targeted in an ambush on his car outside Sana'a. The Houthis now control much of the northwest of the country. The current president, Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi, has not been in the country since February of last year. The conflict, without a doubt, is more about regional domination than internal feud. It pits Sunni Muslim Saudi Arabia against arch nemesis, Iran, the leader of Shia Islam. The rivalry dates back to the 1979 revolution in Iran and has reared its head multiple times in a number of countries, including Bahrain, Lebanon, and more recently, Iraq and Syria. Saudi Arabia shares a porous, almost 1,800-kilometer border with Yemen, a border that has for decades been used to smuggle everything from weapons to humans to drugs into the kingdom. And for a long time, the Saudis tolerated the indiscretion, largely because it had an ally in charge in Yemen at the time, and because the Iranian threat from its south was non-existent. Now Saudi Arabia feels that its security will be a target if Iran, which supports the Houthis, gains a foothold in Yemen. For Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who for all intents and purposes is the de facto ruler of the kingdom, the stakes are too high to ignore the threat. A nuclear power Iran is a frightening thought for Saudi Arabia and its allies. The Trump administration has made no secret of its opposition to the international nuclear deal struck with Iran, and that rhetoric has emboldened the Saudis. The coalition he formed, allegedly with tacit approval from the United States, has for 2 years pounded the Houthis, who have returned the favor almost blow by blow. No quarter has been given by either side as the casualties mount. But Salman has clearly put a marker down, both at home and abroad. The man has arrested and held more than 50 of the top political and financial leaders in Saudi Arabia, forced the Prime Minister of Lebanon to resign on TV while in Saudi Arabia, ostracized Qatar, and started the misadventure that is the Yemen War. The price Yemen has had to pay for this latest proxy war is immense. As Noah demonstrated, the United Nations has listed Yemen as the world's #1 humanitarian crisis, with 17 million Yemenis in need of food, 7 million who are at risk of famine and cholera, causing more than 2,000 deaths. More than 10,000 civilians have been killed in Yemen since the coalition offensive began, and many more injured. For Iran, the conflict, while it seems might have been forced upon it, plays straight into its strategic plan for the region. For one, it cannot appear indifferent while the Houthis, and by default Shia Yemenis, who represent 45% of the population, are being targeted. Domestically, they would risk a revolt if they're seen as abandoning brethren in need. They did the same in Lebanon, in Iraq, and to a certain extent in Bahrain. Secondly, the opportunity to be knocking on Saudi Arabia's door, a thorn in its side, is too good to skip. Yemen can be an extremely valuable bargaining chip for Iran in its fight for dominance in the region. The pressure it can exert on Saudi Arabia from across the border if the Houthis consolidate power is almost immeasurable. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran has tried to export its ideology of Islam to a larger audience as it attempts to restore a balance of power in the Gulf. Surrounded by Sunni Muslim Arab states and following a devastating 8-year war with Iraq are stark reminders for Iran that it needs to continue to try to exert influence at every opportunity. With the stakes this high and each side not ceding an inch, the outcome is far from clear. However, the cost is dear, with mounting casualties and targeting of civilians in schools, funeral processions, and hospitals. Saudi Arabia is losing the public affairs war. Despite its promise of billions of dollars of aid for Yemen and attempts to present Iran to the world as the evil beyond evil, the daily carnage broadcast across the world is not helping its reputation. The latest statement from Crown Prince bin Salman about Iran's supreme leader sums up the thought process of the Saudi government to Iran and what it stands for. Quote, Ayatollah Khomeini makes Hitler look good. End of quote. It takes a certain type of person to make Hitler look good, but it also takes a certain type of person to utter such a statement. While both Riyadh and Tehran seem unwilling to compromise, both are knee-deep in this quagmire with no end in sight. For as long as the two adversaries compete for influence, the Yemen War cannot be resolved separately from other conflicts in the region. There is no endgame here for either, and make no mistake. And much of what happens in the medium term in Syria and Iraq and beyond will have a drastic impact on the outcome in Yemen. Thank you.